Paul, we have a couple of questions actually that I would like to put forward from the audience. The first question is, what portion of systems tests is it possible or typical to automate?
Well, we see this to vary quite a bit depending on the appetite for investing, but it's rare it would be 100%, but we typically strive for over 90%, 90, 95%. But even customers who've got legacy projects or are not sure about how much to invest in this, even just kind of automating 30, 40% of your tests can add a lot of value and get the stakeholders to buy in and invest more.
Okay, great. Another question that we have here from the audience is how much time does living documentation save on average?
Okay, that's interesting. So living documentation, roughly speaking, we find takes documentation down from what was weeks of activity on the engineering team down to days in the release cycle. And on testing and test automation, we've seen it taken down from months on regression testing down to weeks.
Lovely. Another question that's come up is, have you had any quality audits on these processes and how have they gone?
Yeah, so as Bluefruit, as an outsourcing company, we're not actually regulated directly ourselves. Our customers are regulated. So we don't get audited by the regulators, but we do get audited by our customers. And usually they are sort of delighted, I think would be the word. So to see processes which the engineering team are actually engaged with are, the documents being authored by them, and just seeing that we've kind of thought about this and we're doing it for real, we get really positive feedback from our customers.
That's great to hear. Another question that's come up here is, how do you actually reassure customers that shorter release cycles will not introduce poor quality?
So that's a really good question. We start by agreeing a sort of a quality agreement with our customers. So that will discuss which quality activities we're going to be responsible for. And then we also, sometimes in that document, sometimes just engineer to engineers, we agree what sort of metrics to look at as well. So those, you have to be careful with metrics, but as long as the team aren't using them to kind of make decisions themselves, but they're just used for monitoring. So we'll be looking at simple code quality type metrics, as well as things like test coverage and bug tracking and all those kind of things. So really, I think that the key to that answer is agreeing good metrics, healthy metrics, making them clearly available. So we do reports at the end of every release, every sprint. Actually, we do a report to our customer, and any of the kind of quality metrics that they're interested in, we're including that document and comment on those. We also, that's a sort of numbers-based approach in terms of a sort of qualitative type approach as well, is if our customers have engineers on their team, we would welcome and encourage them to be involved in the code reviews as we go. With our Agile hats on, we're always keen to get early feedback. So if they're not happy with the quality, or even if it's just style type stuff in the code, then we like to know early, and the earliest point would be that they could be involved in those code reviews.
Okay, great. Another follow-up question actually that has come up here is, approximately how long does it take to introduce a living documentation or test automation, to an R&D? That depends whether it's an existing project or a greenfield project. So greenfield project, we would often have a kind of ramp-up period in the project where we're kind of
setting up all the infrastructure, and we're maybe just not kind of running at full pace in terms of the requirements. There's maybe early kind of trials going on with usability testing and that kind of stuff, prototyping, and we use that time to get the infrastructure set up. But often it's kind of serviceable within 2 to 4 weeks on a greenfield project. On a legacy project, which is one that's running already, we just wouldn't rush it. So the living documentation and test automation can be eased in gradually. So if we're being involved in the software development, then we'll start using, or even just on the V&V, we'll start refactoring the test cases into a BDD style and start just running those manually, and then bit by bit over time. And so within a few months, we can start getting quite a sort of significant number of the tests, so that stakeholders can kind of see the value of it. Maybe within 3 months, the stakeholders would start seeing the value of that automation, test automation, and then we can kind of ramp it up from there. But we just wouldn't rush it, really. It would just pace it according to how the stakeholders are comfortable funding that.
Okay, great. As a follow-up question to that, someone else has also asked, what's the investment like to set up, automated testing and living documentation?
What's the investment? A bit similar to before, really. It depends what appetite there is. So often customers who have seen it work before, or who have got experience with seeing regression testing taking months, they can immediately see the value for it, and they invest heavily at the beginning. There's a kind of a choice. You can do it in-house, but if you're not familiar with it, it can be quite time-consuming. So again, outsourcing or involving people who've got experience and got the toolkit already can actually really help reduce the kind of cost of that investment, and keeping that to a kind of a minimum.
Okay, lovely. And Paul, someone else here has asked here that he said, I can understand that we can reduce development cycle and end up with a comprehensive documentation, but on their side, the time to register a certain SW version in some countries is becoming a bit of a limiting factor. Would you have any recommendations or tools to simplify the submission or review process?
I think that the main thing is just to be kind of well prepared. So if you've got high quality documents, high quality plans, and you can evidence all of those, so in that kind of first pass of the kind of auditors kind of looking at what you've got, they can see that it's all there, so they don't feel the need to do that full audit. Then that's going to be the kind of best tip at making sure that we avoid a real sort of drawn-out audit. So living documentation really helps on that front, because it really demonstrates that these documents are kind of contemporary to the work being done, rather than kind of too often what we see is kind of customers coming to us who have maybe developed a product, maybe through no fault of their own. Maybe they've developed it and it wasn't medical, and they're bringing it across into medical. But I think that kind of raises eyebrows and really slows down the process.
A couple more questions, Paul. There's quite a lot of interest here. Sphinx looks like quite a developer-orientated tool. It looks quite techy. Is it possible to work with Office documents, which most of this person's colleagues is used to working with?
Yeah, so definitely you can pull together. So those source documents will be a whole range, and those can be Office documents, and you can bring all those together. Setting up the infrastructure on living documentation is a kind of techie activity, but if you can just get good processes around that, if you've got a mix of kind of techie documents, the kind of feature files, that kind of stuff, but let's say your software development plan is in a Word document, that will be fine. They can all be collated together, as long as you have a way of making sure the build server knows how to get the right version of those Word documents. So you need a to make sure your version control has a kind of interface that you can hook into. But basically, it can hook into anything and get converted and added in without a problem.
Okay, great. Another customer here has asked, look, it's great that customers can get a new version earlier, but what about the learning cycles? The user, mostly in the medical field, has to be very, very familiar with the machine and the software itself. Isn't it a contradiction to the short release cycle? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so there can be challenges, and in terms of getting that early feedback, sometimes it might just be around having focus groups. But in our experience, the kind of human factors side of medical devices, I mean, a lot of modern instruments that we're working on, there's a kind of policy that it might need to be used without training. And so you kind of want to see how the users interact with the product. So we, at Bluefruit, we've got kind of UX experts who've got a kind of range of techniques for basically putting an instrument in front of the customer, videoing them, not interfering, seeing how they get on, and recording those interactions and finding what they struggle with. If training is required or an instrument is required, then again, you should take the users through that experience that you're expecting and then put the machine in front of them and see how they get on. And the earlier you find out things that they struggle with or get wrong, we were on an instrument, for example, that needs to be level, and the instructions and the training said keep it level. But early on in the process, you discover that users don't keep it level. And so we needed a software feature in order to address that challenge. So the earlier you know that, that's a hardware change required for that. So there isn't a contradiction there. There's this value of finding out failing early. And actually, if you've got a good user experience, hopefully they don't need to be very, very familiar with the machine in order to use it successfully.
Well, thanks for that answer, Paul. Another question that's been posed here is how do you decide BDD test cases? You know, do these come from requirements documentation?
That's a great question. So it really depends on our starting point. So often, as I said, sometimes we're working in a corporate environment, which is maybe the corporation hasn't got an agile mindset more broadly, but the R&D team do. In those cases, there tends to be a kind of user needs document or a requirements document, which is a bit kind of waterfall, and that would be our starting point. And maybe the product spec will look like that. And then the BDD test cases will just effectively be the software requirement spec. At the other end of the spectrum, if it is a greenfield project, we might push the client to not have a user needs document and actually use the BDD documentation to cover all of the user needs, product needs, and software needs, and kind of start much earlier in the kind of the kind of V model, should we say? So it depends, but earlier the better. I think if I was to be pedantic in those situations where we're starting with the kind of user needs already laid out in the Word document or the product requirements, then I might describe that as acceptance tests driven development, or ATDD. So that's BDD really is about using the agile feedback loop to discover the requirements. So if that document exists already, that's a bit of a barrier to the sort of full BDD process working, and I might just describe that as ATDD. Okay.
Okay, another question we've got here is, are there any commonly used test automation frameworks, script-based, that you would recommend?
That's a really good question. I think we'd need to get back to them on that question. That one's one that the engineering team would answer. But we tend to just use standard open source test automation frameworks. Sometimes we customize them a bit, or we have a missing step and we just use a bit of Python or something to plug those gaps. But yeah, happy to follow up on that question, actually.
Okay, lovely. We'll put you in touch with the person in question. I think that concludes all the questions that we've got here, Paul. I don't know if there's any closing remarks from your end.
No, hopefully everyone's found it really useful and learned a bit. And as I said, any feedback about what perhaps more technical future webinars could be, we'd be happy to look at doing those and give a bit more detail on the technical side of things.
Perfect, that's great. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for joining us for today's webinar. As Paul said, I hope you found it very useful. And obviously, if there's any follow-up questions after this that you would like to direct to Paul and the Bluefruit team, then please do let us know and we will put you in touch with them. Many thanks for your time today and wishing you a great afternoon. Take care.